Well, welcome to the next episode of the Powerless Podcast. In this episode, I talked to Rob Rousseau, who is the co-host and producer of the podcast The Insurgents, along with Jordan Newell. Hosts his live Twitch stream show, I think Monday through Friday, the TRRS live show, so the Rob Rousseau show. And we talk about his sort of lesser-known music career, which is really interesting, just how far it went and what a lot of his life was like for the first formative years of his adulthood. So we talk all about that. We talk about what got Rob to kind of switch from that, go to an everyday job, and then go into social commentary, politics, and everything in between. We talk about a couple of current events issues, mostly involving Canada and some pretty international scandal things that happened over the last couple of weeks. Talk about Rob's new music he's been putting out, which you'll hear a clip both before the episode and a full song at the end that is absolutely fantastic music. I was not aware that he had been putting out new music over the last year or so. So it was really cool to hear about that side of things. Of course, get into his very quick answer for the dream band lineup. Probably the quickest answer we've gotten on this podcast so far, but it was great to talk to Rob. It was a great conversation, and I just really appreciate that he took the time out of his very busy schedule to do this with me. If you like the show, if you are new here, you can make sure to follow me on all the social media platforms at thepowerlesspod. Email me at thepowerlesspod@gmail.com. There is a Patreon now that I started for just $2.50 a month. That you can pay to just support the show. We've had a few people come on. I haven't talked about it much because I really don't like doing the self-promo for monetary stuff there, but check that out if you like the episodes. We've had a lot of great ones lately from Shane Tolis of Silverstein, Andrew Herman from Johnny Booth, Dan Hodson from the Callous Cowboys. On the political side, I've talked to Mac, who is the political commentator, good politic guy, my good friend and great journalist, Shabir Rizvi. Like I said earlier, Jordan Newell. And last week, Alec Hawkins, the editor of some of the episodes, and I started discussing some kind of current music and world news topics. So a lot to cover there. A lot of good back catalog of episodes as we're coming up to the 1-year anniversary and just over a month here of this show. So make sure to check all that out. Again, if you want to support the show, you can look at the link for the Patreon link. And like I said, there's going to be a song playing here from Rob Rousseau's newest project right before we get into the episode. And thanks so much for listening.
It's not too near, it's not too far. We meet tonight at the terroir, where we can dance the pain away until the dawn becomes the day. We're so far.
All right. I am here with Rob Rousseau from The Insurgents, also the TRRSlive show from Twitch. How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing very well, Brandon. Thanks for having me. We finally found the time to do this. We did it.
Yeah. I'm ecstatic that you were able to come on. I had Jordan on actually a couple months ago for this podcast as well. I'm a big fan of both your guys' work with The Insurgents. I think it's like probably the best and most enjoyable. You know, it's a good combination of both like entertainment factor and actually good politics, which usually people kind of fit into one or the other when it comes to political commentary. So I really appreciate you coming on. Been a big fan of your work. I was actually listening to the episode you guys put out today with John from Eve 6 with Live Nation, which kind of goes into this whole podcast where we talk about music and politics and how they can kind of intersect. And so that was like a perfect example of that right there, I guess. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is I know you've mentioned it numerous times throughout your, various political commentary endeavors and things like that of your music career that you had with your band, the Mission District, which is the more I did a deep dive on it, it's kind of hard to find some things at the same time. I can find like a Guardian article on it, I found it very interesting. I was also kind of, when I first got into your podcast, kind of blown away to find out that you had been signed to like a pretty big
Yeah.
record label, and
Yeah. We were kind of
had
like
this
right at the
whole-
step below becoming like genuinely big, but like we were all we came just about as close as you can come to making it in the music business without it actually happening. So
yes. And I can empathize with that as well. So I thought we would talk about that, your venture there,
Yeah, sure.
and then your kind of trajectory into politics, if music ever spoke to you a bit in the political, social view sphere of like what influenced you, and then if we have time, getting into a few current events things here, if we have the time as we record this. So to start off, I guess, for people that don't know, that would watch this, that maybe know you from the Insurgents or your Twitch streaming channel, talk about, I guess, where music started for you as a kid, what got you to start writing music, and where this band or others maybe you were in before it, where that all came from for you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I grew up in a pretty small town called Brockville, Ontario, and I was kind of a somewhat sheltered sort of suburban kid. I was always into music, like I had different phases of stuff that I was into. I've always been a big fan of like classic rock and that kind of stuff. But when I was probably 15, I would say I was about 15, and for whatever reason, Brockville, Ontario had this for a little while, this really thriving like independent music scene and like hardcore music scene. And I had never really been exposed to that kind of music before, like really kind of heavy and totally out of the mainstream, and I had never really countercultural. I had never really been exposed to anything like that before. And there were a couple of people in Brockville that would run these hardcore shows out of the basement of Trinity Church in Brockville, Ontario. And I think I went one time with my friends that were kind of part of that scene when I was about 15, and I just walked into this church, into this like really crazy environment with these bands, both local bands and bands that would come and visit there. And it was really just like, I had never experienced anything like that before in my life. And I didn't even know that this existed. It was like he's peering in behind the veil and seeing this whole other universe that exists that you're not really aware of. And I was just so blown away. And I really thought, like, I want to be on the stage. I want to be doing that, you know? So, I mean, that was how I started playing in bands and doing that, and playing in like hardcore bands in Brockville, and playing at those kind of shows and jamming in my friends' garages and different places like that. I mean, it was just became a big part of my sort of lifestyle and the stuff that I was into. And I carried that through, like when I graduated high school and got into college. I mean, I just had, from about the time I was probably, shortly after that, from like 17, 18, I was like, that's what I want to do, like for my life, for my job. I want to be in a band. I want to tour and do that stuff. And, for about 10 years, between 18 and probably 28, that's really what I tried to do. And I moved to Montreal to go to university. I ended up, through a weird series of events, joining a pop punk band at the time called Full Count this is probably around 2003, about 20 years ago, which is weird to think about.
Weird to say, right?
Jesus Christ. Yeah. Now that it's coming out of my mouth. And so I joined that band, who already had a bit of a following. And I think eventually we wanted to move beyond doing that kind of music. And this was like Montreal in the early 2000s. There was a big wave of like indie rock music. They became a really kind of a central hub for that kind of music, with bands like Arcade Fire and The Stills and Wolf Parade. And there's just this really thriving sort of indie scene. It was becoming kind of maybe along with New York, was kind of becoming the epicenter of this kind of movement of indie bands, indie rock. So I think we kind of wanted to do that. And so we started the Mission District in that kind of a context, in that kind of an environment. And we just spent a couple of years, writing and recording stuff, releasing EPs, playing shows. Like in Canada, I mean, you're limited to kind of what you can do. So it was a lot of like going back and forth between Montreal and Toronto. We'd go to Toronto and play shows there and do stuff here. We'd get on showcases and stuff, trying to make a name for ourselves and trying to open up for bigger bands and stuff like that. And we had a moderate amount of success there. We ended up getting a manager, and I'm losing track of the years when this stuff was taking place now because of how long ago it was.
I know that your album came out in 2008. You had an EP, the self-titled EP, come out in 2006.
Yeah.
And had a couple of singles come out in 2009. That was what I was able to find on the internet, right?
Yeah. So I guess it was probably 2008. We had recorded some stuff around 2008. We went to Toronto. We played a show at there was MTV Canada at that time was doing stuff in Toronto. So we played live on MTV in Toronto, and then we drove from Toronto to Austin, Texas, to play at South by Southwest. That's right.
Or
yeah.
South by Southwest.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we played a show there because we had been featured on Perez Hilton. That was kind of how we got our big break.
Yeah.
Actually, we got featured on Perez Hilton, and we got a spot on South by Southwest at like this Perez Hilton like showcase thing, because he became kind of a joke of a figure, but this is a time when he had quite a lot of clout and ability to raise, especially for musicians and stuff, to raise their profile from nothing to having a lot of sort of viral success. This is in the era before TikTok or anything like that.
Right.
So we went to play the showcase. Nothing really came of this showcase, but we through just like schmoozing and hanging out in Austin, we ended up getting a record deal a few months later with this. It was like a half indie label in the UK called Relentless Records. They had like Cage the Elephant and Katie Tunstall and a couple of other acts. It was like half independent and half connected to Virgin Records. And so that kind of started us off, like getting to like really getting to a point where we were getting to where we sort of wanted to be. We had a deal with EMI in Canada and with Relentless Records in the UK. And for basically 2009, we spent pretty much that whole year just going back and forth between the UK and Canada and touring with different people. We toured with Simple Plan in the UK. We came back to Canada. We did some shows here. We did like a headlining tour in the UK, all these like random UK towns. We had this old decommissioned Royal Mail van that we drove around the UK, basically sleeping in while our singer got the cushy motel rooms. We were sleeping in the van, shivering in the parking lot.
What a cliche right there.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So that was how we spent that year. And we were kind of really starting to do some stuff. We were recording some songs with Andy Green in the UK, the main thing that he's known for is he produced those first two Keane albums, which were quite big at the time. Mm-hmm. And he produced a number of other things in the UK, but nothing quite as big as those Keane albums. And so we were recording stuff with him. Really kind of felt like on the verge of breaking through. It was a really exciting time. And we came back to Canada. We played. This was like New Year's 2009, 2010. We played in Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto at the New Year's show for like 30,000 people or something like that. And it was really starting to feel like, okay, this is really happening now. Like we're actually doing this. Like it was really starting to have that feeling, Mm-hmm. And immediately afterwards, it just all started to go downhill. Relentless Records they merged fully with Virgin. So all of a sudden the people that we were working with, had a whole new kind of team that was there that were not familiar with what we were doing and we had no kind of connection to. And then I think eventually just like sort of the accounting department was just like, we got to cut those guys for whatever tax purposes at the end of the year kind of thing. And that was the end of that. And I guess at that point there was still a possibility of keeping going and doing stuff. We still had a record deal in Canada and there was still a possibility of continuing and trying to do stuff. But I think by that point I was getting to my late 20s. I was getting to be a little bit disillusioned with what we were doing and the music business in general and starting to not really enjoy it anymore.
I bet.
Yeah. And it was a tough time. So I eventually was just kind of like, I don't want to do this anymore. And I left. Yeah. I left and I kind of tried to go to convert to more of a normie lifestyle. I got a job at like an ad agency and tried to go straight, basically, and didn't really think about music for quite a few years after that. But that's how I spent basically my whole 20s. I guess I was about 27, 28 when this kind of ended. You know, it was a really crazy time in my life, a crazy experience, but
yeah, I mean, to say the least,
to
play in front of 30,000 people or so in Toronto for New Year's is, you know, I equate that for an American like myself of like playing when the ball drops. And like,
it was
New
like
York
the Canadian
almost,
version
right?
of
like,
that. The slightly more lame version, but still, yeah.
yeah. But then to kind of have it all fall, like I would feel, I mean, I could totally see where that would both be like such a unique part of your life that a lot of people don't get to experience. And yet, like, in the moment when that stuff all starts to fall apart, to really just like become so cynical of like even wanting to create music, right? It could really pull you out of that, right?
Yeah, and it really did. I lost a lot of confidence. And I really didn't think about it for a couple of years afterwards. But the interesting thing is that there's a connection with what I'm currently doing, is because, you know, I've always been interested in like politics and the news and stuff like that. And, you know, around this time, it was like 2010, and Twitter had really kind of started to take off at that point. And I started to really I had a lot of time to just like sit around in my room. It was a cold Montreal winter, and I was just like, I had a little bit of savings and no real touring to do after like a whole year of always being on the move and always doing stuff. And I just like antisocially locked myself in my room and became fixated on Twitter and like talking about the news and talking about politics on Twitter to anyone who would listen. And for a long time, that was really nobody. And I think I spent a couple of years then just kind of like doing that, just, you know, getting involved in these conversations on Twitter and trying to get people to notice me and pay attention to what I had to say. And for a long time, no one really did. And then just through a series of weird events that I still don't totally understand, I managed to start sort of reaching a really big audience on there. And then that kind of led to me to what I'm doing now.
I think the last time I checked, I don't like go and check people's like numbers on Twitter necessarily, or, you know, as you say, like X the everything app, right? But it's Twitter, right? You're close to like 100,000 followers on there. Like, that's no small feat by any stretch of the imagination. And I guess that just comes from a long standing period of time of paying attention to politics, saying your opinions, and eventually people kind of catch on to it, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, that was part of it. I became, you know, in around the time that the Trump era came in, I was already very radicalized by the Obama era, because I had that sense of hope and optimism, like many people around the world did. People in the US and Canada and around the world were so inspired by that Obama campaign. And I think paying really close attention to what that actually looked like in practice, particularly when it comes to like a foreign policy standpoint, and like Obama's like warrantless drone assassination programs and Libya and all these really horrible things that were going on under Obama. Like after he ran as kind of this anti-war candidate and tried to position himself as being this like progressive person that was going to really change the way things happen, you realize how much people got kind of like hypnotized by that and didn't ignore like what he was actually about, or did ignore, excuse me. And that was very radicalizing. But then Trump comes in after, and it's even more. And I think, you know, I was angry. I was really just angry and upset at the way that the world was going. My son had just been born at that time. And it's kind of like a scary thing when you realize that like our sort of like society is maybe not quite as on firm ground as maybe we would like to imagine, and is maybe on the decline in a lot faster than we're really realizing. And so I started to become really obsessed with sort of like trying to make these conservatives and reactionaries really mad, and making stuff up to say to like make these people as mad as possible and try to get featured on like conservative media and stuff. That became kind of a fixation as well. So that was a big part of building the platform. And also I just similarly to how I was disillusioned with Obama around that time, 2011 or 2012, I really started gravitating to Bernie Sanders. And I thought that's someone that's not not quite as cynical and not using this progressive language because he thinks it's going to be popular, but he says these things even when they're very unpopular. And he has this very kind of funny way about him, and his kind of no nonsense kind of Brooklyn Jewish guy attitude that he has. It's very confusing. I found him a very compelling character. And so it was also really exciting then in like 2015, 2016, seeing him turn into this big national figure. You know, it was really exciting. And yeah, I think when it came time to when 2020 rolled around and his second campaign, I guess I realized that with the way everything had shaken out, that I kind of had an opportunity to be like one of the main like online Bernie bro guys. And I just kind of like leaned into that. I leaned into that because I just thought it was going to be something that would maybe could contribute to something good eventually happening in the United States of America for once. You know, I thought maybe like something, but and then again, you see, we all know how that went, and that in and of itself was radicalizing as well. And then we have everything since that time, the pandemic and the Biden era and everything that's happened since then, which is, it's all been very instructive and has all kind of contributed to where I've ended up.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I was a similar trajectory myself. You know, I remember being, you know, I was in high school when I'm a few years younger than you. I was in high school when Obama first, when Obama first was running and got elected. I grew up in a very conservative household, but there was just something about the guy that grabbed me, you know, and something about the way he was speaking, something about the things he was saying, the fact that it wasn't a household name, all this kinds of stuff. And then, you know, I got into college and really saw policy. Or for myself, I'm a special education teacher.
Oh, cool.
And so when I and I'm not here to talk about myself too much here. We'll get more, but I just mean, like, I very much identify with what you're saying, that you know, life just can kind of radicalize you in a way when you're paying attention to those things. You're not just watching mainstream media or something. You're on social media. You're seeing kind of the reality of the situation. You know, I was actually working on stuff for a music project just the other day where I write lyrics like for politically charged things, and I referenced, you know, the you know, I think it was Daniel Hale that brought up during the Obama administration about the 90% of, you know, the deaths from the drone strikes during Obama. 90% of them were civilians, right?
Yeah.
And all these kinds of things. I remember learning about that, and just like, for the longest time, you know, both in school, you know, I'm a public education teacher. And so I know this firsthand as well, like both in school, from mainstream news outlets, from everything else, that like you're really taught this like dichotomy of it's this group or that group when it comes to Democrats or Republicans. Or I know to a lesser extent in Canada, it's not quite a two-party system, but there's very much like two sides of the coin there.
And it is, we have multi-parties, but we've only ever elected two of the parties, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. So I view Canada, you look at the multi-party system in Canada, and if you imagine like the Squad had their own party that caucused with the Democrats rather than just being part of the Democratic Party. I mean, that's basically what it's got. Or maybe if you had Texas that had the Texas Party,
NDP, right?
Exactly.
What it is, right? Yeah.
Or if you had like the Texas Party that was just advocating for Texas, pro-Texas policies, you know, things like that.
Yeah, that's what happens a little bit with the province you're in, right? There's a lot of that kind of interesting social construct there too. But yeah, the point being that I think for a lot of people at that time, just life radicalized you in a way, right? But in between, obviously, you know, you kind of getting disillusioned from music, and I'd actually want to talk about that if it comes in the conversation a little more. You referenced today in your episode you put out with the Insurgents about like the 360 deals you guys had to do, and how like probably the business side of things really downtrodden you guys, along with some other things, I'm sure, but like the whole business practice of labels and all that can really disillusion you from the creative aspect of being an artist. But when you got into, you said politics were always interesting for you, news was always interesting for you. Were there I know it, like you're I identify with a lot of the same views you have on a lot of things from what I've seen you talk about. Were there certain like literary things you read? Were there certain public figures that you learned about? Were there Was it just kind of life experience? What kind of brought you to this, other than what we just referenced with Obama and Trump and all that kind of stuff, the more mainstream things? What are the things that kind of helped radicalize you and inform you to politics outside of sort of the mainstream electoral, bipartisan views that a lot of people have when it comes to politics, or where did that kind of come from for you?
I don't know. It's like I've weirdly always had a sort of, I felt this connection with socialism, and I've always been really fascinated in like socialist like iconography. Like when I went to Europe when I was 19, I spent some time in Hungary, and I went out to see Statue Park in Hungary, where they took all the communist statues after the revolution, and you can go and check them out. And I've always been very fascinated with that, despite not having, we live in a really anti-communist society where we don't really learn about what that is. And we're told certain things about socialism and the USSR or what have you. But I've always felt this sort of like it being drawn to it, like for whatever reason. So, I mean, that was one thing that the more I became disillusioned with like electoral politics and like Obama and Bernie and electoral politics here in Canada too, with our kind of fake liberal democracy that we have here as well, the more I started being interested in socialism and actually wanted to learn about, socialist theory and started to read a little bit more about these figures. I guess if you could point to something that, that brought me along that path, I think one of my favorite books of all time is For Whom the Bell Tolls by Hemingway, which is about the Spanish Civil War and the main character who lives in the mountains fighting with this guerrilla army against the fascism in Franco Spain. So I think that was part of it, because that connected to that so well, and then learning a little bit about the Spanish Civil War and who was going over there to fight against fascism. There's a really interesting connection with that. And Canada, right. There was Canadians in the what was called the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion that volunteered to go fight for the Republican forces in the Spanish Civil War, which is one of the cooler things that Canadians have ever done. And of course, our government afterwards said, like, hey, you're not allowed to do that anymore. No one's allowed to go there.
None of that anymore.
We don't like that. And learning about people like Norman Bethune, who was not only participating, it was a doctor who was not only participating in the Spanish Civil War, but there's a big Norman Bethune statue in Montreal, like right near where I went to school at Concordia University. So he went to he was a surgeon who was part of the Spanish Civil War. He eventually went to China to help with the Chinese Revolution. He was a surgeon in Mao's army, basically in the Chinese Revolution. Right. He died. He was doing surgery and cut his finger and got infected, and he got blood poisoning and died. So in the Chinese Revolution, and there's big monuments to Norman Bethune in China, and Mao actually wrote a really touching eulogy for him, which I return to often, probably once a year, like when I think about Bethune, because Mao, you think about Mao as this big iconoclastic figure, and it's so touching. He's talking about like, Comrade Bethune sent me many letters and I was too busy. I didn't get around to reading them. And now I wish I had. And he has the sense of regret. It's really beautiful. Right. You got to say your homies, you love them, like while they're still around, that's Mao's telling us about that. Yeah. So I guess that those are the kind of things that made me interested in socialism and made me start to want to ask myself, like, whether what we're told about socialism, whether what we're told about the USSR or China or whatever is really accurate, or whether there's something more going on. I think these are all things that contributed to me wanting to learn more about that and wanted to sort of deprogram myself from what we're taught to believe about these kind of figures and what socialism is and what's this all supposed to represent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. It's cool that, as an American, I know it's so surprising. I have not learned about some of those figures you were just talking about, much at all, let alone any of the other, like, more socialist figures from the United States. We don't learn much at all.
Yeah, they don't want you to know about that in stuff.
School.
Yeah.
Right. But it is interesting to hear about that kind of, especially in relation to some current events coming from Canada that you've already talked about on your own podcast, with things with like what went on in Parliament just like a couple, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, time's a blur, but it brought to light to me a little bit, especially from some of what you talked about with, in relation to the connection of Ukraine and Canada. And I know I'm just kind of going on a tangent here from what I was initially going to talk about, but how you had talked about on your podcast a couple episodes back, I think, that there was this big like kind of Ukrainian socialist Canadian
Yeah.
cohort in Canada for a long time, and then it kind of shifted gears to things that it kind of encapsulates it perfectly a couple of weeks ago, where you saw somebody for anybody that is less politically, this podcast has a lot of people that listen primarily to music, so maybe they didn't follow this as much, but it was an international scandal of salute. I mean, basically like propping up, applauding, doing a standing ovation for a straight up SS, Nazi soldier from Ukraine. And then, you go to like somebody like me that doesn't know as much about the ins and outs of things that go on in Canada, the social dynamics, the everything in between. I always think of like horrific statues being an American thing when it comes to Confederates and stuff like that. But then I was actually reading, and I just was bringing this up because I thought I figured you knew this, and I just thought it'd be interesting to bring up was about that some of the different figures and some of the different people from like a similar division, all that kind of stuff that they actually have statues for.
Yeah.
In a few different places in Canada, right? Like,
yeah, we have actual monuments to this Waffen SS division in a couple of different places.
It's very interesting to both from all sides of it to hear both the response from the Canadian Parliament, where again I'm probably going to butcher the terms, but the essential like Speaker of the Parliament that did this was acting like this was a whoopsie, all these different things,
Google
like
the
people
guy.
acting like. And then I actually screenshotted this to put in my notes today when I was at work on a break real quick of you responding to I only know his name and print it, so I'm probably pronouncing his last name improperly, but John Cipher, who is the former CIA crazy person that always has like the worst takes of all time on Twitter, somehow gets dunked on nonstop, but like shared that Politico opinion article that's like, actually, if you fought against the USSR in World War II, you might not have been a Nazi, and like all these weird things that are going on.
Yeah,
like
if you volunteered for the SS, it does kind of make you a Nazi, though. Unfortunately, yeah.
It's like they're really conflating this whole idea of like, they're trying to throw nuance into something that is like, for once in politics, principally unnuanced, right? So I guess like, what do you make from that? In for Canada, as an American, a lot of the people that might listen to this that might not know as much, like where did that you reference like this Ukrainian socialist front, in years back historically. How does that translate from that to propping up Ukrainian Nazis and kind of conflating like this entire issue? Like where does that come from overall?
Well, I mean, you talk about histories that you are not taught about when you grow up, right? I mean, and I think World War II and the Nazis has become a really important part of Western propaganda, both in Canada and the United States. And we're just told the Nazis were bad, and we fought the Nazis and we won. And so we're against the Nazis, and that's the end of the story. That's kind of, and you see the movies, you see the John Wayne movies, you see Saving Private Ryan or whatever it is. And you're like, of course we don't like Nazis and we're against them. But the whole thing about what actually happened to the Nazis after the war, that kind of gets really downplayed a lot. And were they actually defeated, or did they get absorbed? And I think that's where it opens up some really interesting questions that, when you start digging at these threads, or tugging at these threads, reveals some pretty startling stuff that we're not really ever told about. And as far as Canada's role, number one, I mean, we talk about our ruling class. We're totally okay with Nazism, totally okay with Adolf Hitler, right up until the point where it became like really literally impossible to really defend that. Like the Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King met Hitler in 1937, I think, and wrote in his journal, like, this guy's great, I absolutely love this guy. He wants to kill Russians, he wants to kill Soviets and communists, and they're persecuting Jews who we all are vile anti-Semites as well. No problem there. And, they really, that's how they viewed Hitler. Like they were, it was really good for business, for the elite class, the capitalist class. And he was fighting. So he was killing communists and persecuting them. So no real problem there. And it only really became a problem like as World War II progressed and the absolute horrors of the Nazi regime started to really escalate. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole American component to this, but if you want to talk about Canada, that's what I was talking about a few weeks ago, which is that, there were these, I think something like 7 million Ukrainians joined the Red Army during World War II to fight fascism very bravely and correctly. And in fact, helped save all of our asses from this fascist menace.
Yes, 100%.
But a small number of Ukrainians, joined these like partisan groups such as the UPA, I believe is the acronym, which was like the insurgent army, who carried out really brutal, vile acts of mass murder against Jews and Polish people, almost to the point that it was like too much for the Nazis. The Nazis were like, okay, like we got to tone it down here actually, because this is like getting out of hand. And then you had other people like this guy Hunka, who joined the actual like SS, who swore allegiance to Hitler to join the SS. And like you're hinting at, there's been this whole process of revisionism that's going on, or this kind of like, well, we got to be nuanced about that, or suggesting that like it was some impossible position that they just were forced to join the SS because they were under this kind of Soviet occupation. But I mean, these people were not fighting Soviets. They were carrying out war crimes and massacres against civilians predominantly. And they were doing so at the behest of the Nazis. So really not something that there's any nuance over, or any like, oh, you kind of have to understand it's complicated. It's not complicated. It's totally black and white. They were Nazis.
Yeah.
And then after,
sometimes
So go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Sometimes I was just gonna say, sometimes like I know like the online political brain is to like, talk about opinions that even aren't worth mentioning a lot, just for the sake of hearing yourself speak, or like in written form, see your words out there for people to comment on. But it's like, at some point, like, how do people like? I like what you and Jordan will reference on your podcast a lot. That it's like, how many times have I heard you guys say, or other political analysts I'll listen to say, like, 10 years ago, at least somebody wouldn't have said this out loud, right? Somebody wouldn't have been like, hey, let's make discourse about whether or not like a Nazi is a Nazi, right? Like, it just kind of would have been something people would have thought is absurd. I'm not saying there weren't problems already there, but at least they wouldn't come out with them in full bravado. And
I think we were all in agreement that there was no real nuance there to be had. No, I think it's something that I talk about a lot and I think about a lot that's been really alarming. I think over the last couple of years, this process of historical revisionism and this kind of Nazi apologia, there's kind of a Red Scare that's been a new Red Scare that's been increasing in intensity really since 2016, 2017. And it's really started to kind of exponentially get a lot worse. And along with this Red Scare, you're getting this kind of revisionism and you're getting this kind of Nazi apologia. And the alarming thing for me is like, even in the early Trump era, when there was these like, there was the Charlottesville rally and all these kind of like new right, like, or alt-right, fascist sympathizers, you can be generously call them. And a lot of people on the sort of more liberal or progressive or social democrat or socialist side seem to all be united in agreement. These people are Nazis. Like, they're not good. We need to kind of defeat these people. Like, they're what they're advocating for is really ugly. And now I think the really disturbing thing is that there's a lot of people that would totally in agreement on that. A couple years ago, now they're sitting here going like, well, just because someone joined the SS, I mean, it's not really, they don't necessarily make them a Nazi. And it's kind of like, what's going on here? Like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, what the fuck are we talking about?
This is not good. And so to go back to Canada and this connection with Ukraine, I think that's what happened after the war, is that we imported, the actual number is not known because this has been obscured so much and covered up so much, but some people estimate up like in the thousands of these former SS Ukrainian nationalists, and we brought them into Canada knowing full well who they were. And that's it. Like you mentioned, we had at that time a Ukrainian diaspora here in Canada that was very like socialist leaning. And this was part of an effort to kind of really disrupt that and to bring these fascists into these communities. And it destroyed this kind of burgeoning sense of sort of the socialist front, like you're talking about. They got hired by private, capital to act as like muscle for union busting efforts. They were spying on left-wing activists and doing all kinds of stuff. And so we created basically through this process, this really reactionary, fascist sympathizing Ukrainian diaspora. And that's exactly why we have monuments in certain Ukrainian graveyards to these SS divisions, because we imported so many of these Waffen SS guys that are not ashamed. Like, they're quite proud of this history, and they've been pretty open about it for years. And I think it's weirdly slid under the radar, even though that's not like, there was a big outcry about this in the 80s. There was a research paper that came out in the 80s that the government put together talking about this. There was like, I was watching on my stream the other day, there was like a CBC feature on this from like 30 years ago talking about this problem and talking about how we have these like this incredibly reactionary Ukrainian diaspora and this whole problem with importing these SS guys. There was a 60 Minutes piece on it. Like, it's not totally a secret, but we still, like,
right. Again,
Again, you grow up in this country where the Nazis are bad and we fought the Nazis. That's the end of the story. But all of a sudden you start realizing this stuff, and it's like, well, what's going on here? Like, what kind of country am I living in here? And it makes you kind of question everything about what you've been told about where you grew up,
It's the cynical solidarity in me that makes me at least like appreciate that, like, it's not just the United States that has like horrific, terrible things that we just kind of gloss over and try to, move past and like pretend like we were like, I mean, there's a whole thing with the United States where they pretend that, we won the war against the Germans.
Yeah, of
which
course.
didn't even happen.
Yeah.
Right. but yeah, I mean, it's a good
I saw
reminder
it in a movie.
that,
I don't
like,
know.
Yeah. It's a good reminder, I think, for a lot of people in the States that, like, it is an overall like West problem of like not really addressing the reactionary elements within our very like political structure, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing for people to note, and I really appreciate that you talk about that a lot. In a very, again, like I said, you don't like beat people over the head with it. You make it entertaining, but you still find a way to make sure to talk about this. To go back to like a little bit of some of the other, and I appreciate you taking the time with me late at night tonight. But
no problem.
To talk about music and politics a little bit, and I know this is old news, but I wanted to bring it up in the context of music, because I found your commentary on this hilarious. It was mentioned in the first Republican debate. You had a long live stream that you put up on YouTube about it. That was, for me, that like I would tune into your streams more often, but with work and everything else, I can just see what usually is recorded or whatever else on YouTube. With the Oliver Anthony song, what was it?
Richmond, north of
Richmond. Yes, the only reason why I bring this up, I know it's kind of old news at this point, quote unquote, with how like the news cycle goes.
Yeah.
But I had a couple of people the other day mention to me how much they thought this song was so like from the heart and people like just singing from their gut, and it's so I don't know if you follow the journalist Abby Martin that does Empire Files.
Yeah, I love Abby. Yeah,
Media Roots, all that kind of stuff. Her and her brother, on the Media Roots podcast, they actually went in a deep dive on it, on how it looked like from the investigations they were able to do, that he maybe didn't even write the song. And like there's all these different things with like a guy from the Blaze,
the
like,
Blaze
helping promote it,
conservative influencer, like just kind of invented it. Yeah.
What is amazing to me about that, and I just am kind of bringing this up in reference to reactionary things, people kind of bogarting populist views for the sake of like ripping on poor people, which can kind of be in line with what we were just talking about in a sense, in a lot of ways. It's funny to me that people take that song still, like it's still getting plays, by the way. I looked it up today before I talked about this to make sure I wasn't talking about something completely irrelevant. No, but it's still like really high up there as far as like country songs and singles and things like that. That people acted like this was the first country song that ever talked about these issues.
Yeah. Country music like used to be about like killing your boss and stuff, back in the day.
That Johnny Cash didn't exist, as an example or whatever else. I don't know, like, for you, I felt, I guess I'll just say my piece on this a little bit. It's funny to me, like, I heard this from people that listen to, like, hardcore music, alternative music, post-hardcore, or whatever else that like also grasped onto the song that are maybe less politically minded, and they acted like it was the first politically charged song they had ever heard in their entire lives. Did you kind of get that, like, especially with it being mentioned in the Republican debate? I was kind of thrown that people acted like this was like the first time somebody had written a song about social issues. It was very bizarre. I don't know.
Yeah. Usually they say that's woke and it's not good when you do that. And you're like, get the politics out of the music. Just shut up and sing.
Shut
up
and sing.
Yeah, exactly.
But I guess like I guess I'm trying to find a way to articulate this well, but like obviously that song's like a couple of months past or whatever, its relevancy in a lot of ways, but like I guess like from in general, I thought it brought up a good point, and you brought it up very funnily on your stream that when you talked about it, but like of how people just sort of pretend some of these issues are talked about through the Republican Party, talked about through like reactive lens or like faux populist lens or whatever. What do you think the problem is there with everything you cover, where Democrats, or in your case in Canada, the Liberal Party, everything else, that they're missing the mark on like how to talk to regular people? Because I think it's very astounding to me that both in the past couple of Republican debates, especially the second one, which is an absolute shit show, that they are able to, that they talk more about like the everyday working people in a lot of sense than what the neoliberal, Democratic Party that really doesn't seem like it knows what it's doing, talking to poor working class people, everything in between. Like how does that, I guess, like in your view, like how does that happen in conjunction with like the fact that we have a party that all they are doing is focusing on corporate tax, incentives, like helping out the biggest consolidation of power when it comes to capital? Like how, I guess I'm losing track of my question here a little bit, but I guess like where's that missing for the liberals, I guess, in both Canada and the United States, that like these right-wing people are able to take these topics, talk about them, and then turn them on the head to just like hate poor people? Where do you think that really comes from? Where do you think the problem is there? And why aren't they addressing it the way they should?
Well, I think the problem is that we're living in these sort of like the consequences. We're living through the consequences of economic policies that were really implemented in the early 80s, in the dawning of the neoliberal era, which happened under Reagan and Thatcher, and in Canada you had Brian Mulroney and other figures that were part of that. And, this is like a sort of an economic policy that was spearheaded by Republicans and conservatives. And, what are the hallmarks of this kind of neoliberal era? It's like deindustrialization. They offshored the entire manufacturing industry, destroying unions, cutting taxes for the wealthiest people. And this was sort of the promise of neoliberalism, was like, yeah, we're going to get rid of all these high paying union jobs that you used to be able to get and support a family on and buy a home off of. Those are all going away. we're shipping those jobs to China and Mexico or wherever else in the developing world where we can have pay the as little as possible for labor and not have to deal with these unions like demanding like living wages and stuff. And so, this has created massive amounts of inequality. And because of the success of people like Reagan and Thatcher, you've had this system now where liberals and Democrats have been trying to play catch up, and they embraced all these policies like Bill Clinton or like a Barack Obama, who embraced all these same policies of austerity and tax cuts and deindustrialization and all these things, and maybe had like a slightly different view of certain social issues or were slightly less mean about it than Republicans were. But you have basically a two-party system that are promoting really, really similar economic policies with maybe a few subtle differences. But I think over time, liberals now, because of like Clintonism and NAFTA and all that, have kind of owned this. They've owned this economic policy, whether they were not involved in like implementing it at first, but they went all along with all these economic policies and they kind of own it. So, that was that's what led to Trump being elected. Is you've got Hillary, you've got a Clinton running, and in these like these working class strongholds that used to be like former Democratic Party strongholds where popular union activity and these big industrial centers in America, they're like, well, fuck you. We're not voting for you. We're going to vote for this guy who we don't really like or trust, or we're just not going to vote at all. I think that's probably what a lot of people think. I think we talked a little bit too much about the Obama to Trump voter, but this is the issue. It's like Obama was able to kind of put together these big coalitions because he was incredibly charismatic. He's a great political communicator, and he run these historic campaigns. The second one was a lot less successful than the first because people had become aware at that time that it was mostly bullshit. But I think that's a big problem, is that liberals kind of own that process, and it's created this weird situation where then you have right-wing populists like Trump who benefited from this whole process. Like it's farcical that conservatives can pretend to be opposed to this
brain
at
a little
all.
bit.
It does. But then you have these people going to these communities that have been devastated by this process, that have unions have been destroyed and all the factories have closed and no one can afford a home. Everyone's in debt. People are having addiction. There's a big addiction crises. And that's the result of these neoliberal economic policies, which have just increased the inequality and led to millionaires and billionaires doing better than anyone that has ever done in human history, while everyone else is just getting less and less and less. So I think it's created these. That's the kind of situation that someone like Oliver Anthony is coming out of, and however honest or however sincerely held his views are, or whatever role that these conservative influencers played in promoting that, I think it's given people this really distorted idea about who is screwing them exactly. And there's been also, alongside all of these big economic consequences, there's been this like real right-wing propaganda push that blames government for everything, and convincing people that the government is the reason that all of this stuff has happened. And of course the government played a role, but ultimately these are ideas that are promoting even more of the exact same economic policies of tax cuts and austerity, which led to the crisis in the first place. But because it seems to be only really right-wing people that are willing to go and make these arguments. And we're seeing the same thing in Canada with Pierre Poilievre right now doing the same thing.
Oh God. Yeah.
Talking about all these issues and talking about the way people are struggling and not being able to buy groceries and not being able to get a home and all this. And people respond to that. Oh, my needs are being spoken to. But ultimately this is kind of a sleight of hand where you're acknowledging these issues, you're acknowledging these crises, but on the other hand, you're just promoting a vision for government where let's give your boss a tax cut. Let's make it so even fewer people have food stamps and and you can get less and less with that. And that's the problem. That's the reason you're struggling. Yeah. That's why you don't have a job. That's why you can't get a home. It's because too many people are on welfare. Too many people are welfare queens getting fudge rounds with their food stamps. and people are just being taxed. They're being taxed so much, like the poor. But like that's the kind of sleight of hand, was like the person that's getting taxed too much is not necessarily the struggling working class person, but their boss and the people that were involved in this whole deindustrialization process in the first place. So that's the really kind of grotesque thing that's going on, is that you have right-wing people that are capitalizing on all these crises and speaking to these people, and then at the same time advocating for the exact same economic policies that caused the problems in the first place. And that's where we're at. And that's what allows someone like Oliver Anthony to become a big star singing this kind of song that has this very kind of faux populist right wing economic message.
I gotta admit real quick, and then I'll get to a few of those things, and we'll wrap up soon. I appreciate your time, but I admit, like, somebody shared on Twitter, there was like a communist account that shared like a short of that song, and it was the first verse and I think the chorus.
Yeah.
You know,
you're like, oh, this is great.
And I was
like, this is cool.
They shared they're like bring this kind of country music back, and I watched it and I was like, hell yeah, like this is awesome. Like we need to see this back. And then I went to Spotify.
To sleep. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like cleaning my house, and I put it on Spotify, was listening, and it was before like the whole thing came out and people were really like taking sides on it or whatever. And then like the second verse came on, and I heard it while I was like cleaning my bed, like probably cleaning a toilet or something. And I was like, wait a second, what?
Yeah, what was that?
What did that say? You know, and like looked at it, and it was like, oh, this is one of those.
If you're 5'3" and you're 300 pounds, taxes ought not to pay for your bags of fudge rounds. One of the worst lyrics that I think I've ever heard in any song.
Also,
really,
politics aside, just really dumb lyric.
Yeah, just really bad lyric.
Bad. That's like the worst lyric I've ever heard. But it to your point, it really does speak to you. And this is something I've like tried to reconcile with a lot, because I don't like to be one of those people that, like, as we see, especially through political commentary, where they kind of go left with no, quote unquote, left with no morals, and they end up only attacking the Democratic Party or the Liberal Party, not really acknowledging how crazy the fascist side of the right-wing reactionary things can be. But, you know, that you start really seeing, say, the Liberal Party in Canada or the Democratic Party in the United States, for a lot of things, at least nationally, as like spoilers to a lot of activist movements, on the ground leftist movements, you know, solidarity with workers, all those kinds of things. And it leaves a space open for, you said, you know, Trump or Josh Hawley or all these other people that know how to say the game, but at the end you say, like you said, the populism ends with like giving a tax cut to your boss and telling you to shut the fuck up and go to work. It just feels so dystopian and everything else, but it's good to reconcile with the fact that both of those things can be true, that you should point out the right-wing freaks and also realize that, like, you know, your mainstream quote unquote liberal party in either country is not looking out for your benefit, and you have to either push those people or go for a third party or single issue movements or, you know, on the ground protesting, whatever else, to really like focus your politics on things that actually matter. So that's what I appreciate about yours and Jordan's podcast, specifically The Insurgents, that you guys do a good, like, I don't mean middle ground as in middle ground politically, but I mean middle ground on both talking about the reality of electoral politics, that you should do what you do there, like whatever it is. If you vote for somebody, that's fine for harm reduction in certain instances, but also the fact that, like, these people are not there to save you, and there's a lot more you should be doing, whether it's focusing on things like Jordan's done with like the Move On campaign, with various things they've talked about over the years, or what you both talk about just in general, single issues and all those kinds of things, that it's good to open people's eyes while also not just like trying to go into the corner of like who's the most left and who's going to do the most thing contrary into the Democratic Party or the Liberal Party. Because that all becomes, that's a lane that a lot of people go into that I think is, I don't even know if it's destructive. It's just not useful for anybody, you know?
Yeah, well,
so
it's useful
really
for them getting clout and YouTube subscriptions and that kind of stuff. That's very useful for that.
Yeah.
This is real activism. Then you subscribe to my YouTube channel and super chat me.
Yeah. Yeah. Or seeing them interview like the say the Green Party candidate, Dr. Cornel West, who's like absolutely fantastic on all
he's
fronts.
the man.
And still finding a way to like circumvent and like shit on them in a
Yeah,
way.
why
It's
are
like,
you,
what
why are you
doing?
standing? You're asking Cornel West why he stands up for like social justice. Like, are you fucking kidding me? Jesus Christ.
Are you stupid?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so ridiculous. Two last questions. I don't mean to take too much more of your time. One that I meant to ask earlier, but then we started talking about all this stuff. But it's a little out of conjunction. But since music was big in your life, now politics, news, and everything else has been very big in your life. Has there ever been a few bands, whether it was some big name ones, more, you said you kind of got into the hardcore underground scene, that's very politically, socially charged in a lot of instances. Was there ever music that influenced you, whether it be the landmark song from Oliver Anthony or others, that's my bad attempt at a joke. Did anything ever influence you politically when it came to music or art in general? And then I'll get to my last kind of goofy question to end things here. But did any music or art or anything like that ever really influence your politics?
I mean, I think you could argue that it started me down a certain path. I think ultimately you can get started down a certain path. And like you pointed out, there's a lot of like really socially conscious hardcore music that exposed me to sort of different ideas about politics and society that I'd never really been exposed to before. But also you can realize in retrospect, like how that can lead you down bad paths as well. I think a band like Earth Crisis is a good example. It had that really big vegan and straight edge kind of like, socially conscious message, which sometimes is pretty valuable. But then you look at like an Earth Crisis song like Firestorm, which is basically about like purging drug users and killing them.
Very reactionary in some ways.
I think that can lead you down bad paths as well. I think there's bands like Rage Against the Machine, obviously, that promoted certain ideas in this kind of very mainstream sort of aggressive sound that was really commercially popular, but they had really overall a pretty decent political message in most ways. There's people like Bruce Springsteen, who have kind of, talking about Oliver Anthony, these kind of working class message. I think Bruce Springsteen is someone that has built his whole career in telling those kinds of stories. Like one of my favorite albums is Nebraska by Springsteen, the more stripped down kind of acoustic album, really about these kind of people living these lives of kind of quiet desperation and downtrodden people. And, I think that's great. I think you also see Springsteen become like then a multimillionaire and hosting a podcast with Barack Obama, which is in itself kind of problematic and not great either. But that's what I mean. I think there's music that can send you down that path, but ultimately you can't rely on that to inform your political beliefs. It can introduce you to certain viewpoints that maybe, like, again, I was a sheltered suburban kid and I wasn't really ever exposed to a lot of these ideas except through music, but you can't leave it at that. I think at that point, if you're being on that path, it's then up to you to kind of pick up that thread and start trying to do the reading. I think that's something I've come around to a lot over the last couple of years, actually trying to read more, like,
same here.
Socialist theorists or, people like that, or and really engage in that. I think at first when I was getting into like leftism, socialism, I was like, we don't need to be doing homework. Like we all know like what these concepts mean. And actually I do think that's something that I've come around on a lot over the last couple of years. I actually think it's really important too. And you realize how, if people did more of this reading, we wouldn't be having the same kind of like arguments on the left that were settled, a century ago, in these kind of books.
It's that old cliche on Twitter where like some communist like responds to somebody like read Lenin, but you're like, actually, maybe you should.
Yeah.
It's absolutely
it's pretty good actually. Well, just on that note, it's like you look at someone like Lenin, I think, and again, you get told all these things about the Russian Revolution and the USSR and communism, and you also think you get this idea that this theory is so inscrutable and complex and academic, but you read someone like Lenin or Mao, and it's engaging and easy to understand and read, and it's funny. Like, you really don't realize how Lenin accessible it is.
Yeah, I actually got, I don't know if you can see it because it's pretty dark in here, but I've got a Lenin poster back there of him like sweeping billionaires off the planet. Yeah. So I absolutely understand what you mean by that. And that's what got me into it. Cause like, like Capital and all those other ones, like the more academic readings, like they are hard to digest, but there's plenty of things for anybody listening that wants to hear about communist literature from Rob and I. There are things from Mao or Lenin or all these different things that like are very concise, not written in overly academic language, that still really spell it out, and in some ways better because it's like more like lived experience and not just academic. And like they're 100 pages, some of them are like 100 pages long or less.
Yeah.
Like I think State and Revolution is like less than that.
Yeah. And like, listen, like
So-
I was disillusioned with electoral politics and Obama and Bernie and the Democrats and the Liberal Party and all that shit. You read State and Revolution, it's like, oh, I don't actually live in a democracy. That makes sense to me now. It's like, all these parties,
right.
There might be little differences between them, but ultimately it's a one party. It's a dictatorship of capital, and these different parties are just different wings of the capitalist class, and they kind of have these little debate club arguments with one another to kind of seem like there's these big differences, but ultimately they're interested in like perpetuating this grotesque system and keeping the money machine turned on at all times and benefiting the exact same people. And it's like, oh, okay, that's actually a lot more clear to me now when you read that.
Right. Yep. 100%. I'm glad we can agree on that note. Last quick question. I asked this to everybody their first time on the podcast, since it's sort of a music-based podcast, although we talked about music for probably 25 minutes of this or so. But I asked this question to everybody. I asked Jordan this as well, so I'll ask you as well from the Insurgents. If you could make a dream team band from artists living or dead, this is what we end on every time. Who would you? You could be in the band. You could not be in the band in this instance since you're not in a current band. But like, who would you add into that lineup?
Yeah, the four that spring to mind. This is my dream team lineup of musicians: is Don Fagen, Walter Becker, Michael McDonald, and Bernard Purdy. You got to put those four guys together sometime. You're going to see some magic.
Yeah, there we go.
I became extremely Dan-pilled, as if you can tell, over the last couple of years. I always had an appreciation for Steely Dan through my dad, who was a musician, and listened to them and listen to Don Fagen's solo album. But over the last couple of years, they've completely just taken over like everything that I am always listening to, and absolutely love it.
I absolutely love that answer. I also love that you are officially like the quickest person with that response on here of all time. Rob, thanks so much for coming on and talking about your music career and shooting the shit with me about politics. I really appreciate it.
Do you want to talk about my new music project? I can talk to you about that if you want to finish off on some music stuff.
Yeah, you have a new music project?
Yeah, I don't really talk about this that often. I don't know.
I had no idea.
I make more music more just for myself, for my own enjoyment. But I guess because I do this stream every day, and I didn't want to rely on like other people's background music and stuff. And I started just like, that's kind of how I got back into starting to make some more music, just making some electronic music that I can play in the background of my streams, or making the theme song, or doing that. And over the last year or so, I started recording some actual songs, like with guitar and singing and stuff. And I kind of created this. It's actually a couple years ago. I didn't mention this, but when I left the band, I did record like a solo EP, and I kind of created this kind of fake band called Hurstwood.
Okay.
So I didn't really do anything with that for about 10 years. And then just this year I started writing and recording some more songs. I kind of got back into it now that I kind of got the taste of creating stuff, and I got a new computer to do streaming on, which made it a lot easier. I had a better sort of setup.
Right.
So I started just writing and recording some songs over the last year, and I'm getting close to an album worth of songs. My goal is to put out an actual album. I think that would be like a sort of a culmination of everything that I've kind of been working on for years and years. So I do, I don't talk about this that much, but I do have a bunch of songs online if people want to hear them. It's hurstwood.bandcamp.com. Bunch of things on there. Nothing really like over. I did put out one song that's like kind of political, that's kind of influenced by that kind of Springsteen, Nebraska kind of sound, but it's overall it's kind of poppy music, poppy kind of electronic guitar, indie rock kind of stuff, and it's been a lot of fun. I really enjoy writing and recording. And, you know, I'm not a great producer. I like to think I'm a kind of okay, decent songwriter, but I've just been having fun doing that, writing and recording some stuff and putting
That's
it online.
awesome.
And
Yeah.
I listen to it in my car or when I'm walking around or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's enjoyable. I've had a really great time doing that.
Well, in that vein, I always play songs at the end of this. I will go to that, but you tell me we could play one of them at the end of this. What which one of those songs would you want to play at the end of the podcast?
Sure. I think my favorite of the songs is called Tech Noir, which is a reference to Terminator. There's the bar in Terminator where Linda Hamilton's character goes to hide out. And but if you want to play the more Springsteen-y one that has this more political message, which I think is a better working class anthem than the one Oliver Anthony got super famous doing. Personally, I know I'm biased because it's me, but it's called Work. So maybe that would make the most sense to tie us together into everything we've been talking about.
You know what I'll do is I'll take a clip from the first one you just referenced with the Terminator reference. I'll take a clip of that, play it at the beginning, and then I'll play the full song of Work at the end.
Sure,
so
yeah.
that's what we'll do.
There we go.
We'll do a double feature of your songs.
Cool.
That's awesome because I was actually going to ask you what song you wanted to play at the end if you wanted to play a Motion District song or whatever else you wanted to play at the end of it. But we'll play your songs you've put out more lately. That's awesome. I need to check those out. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So we'll play those at the end, and then just go ahead and share where, and I'll put this in the intro as well, but share where people can find you and what you've got going on.
Yep. I'm on Twitter still. I'm going down with a ship there, at Rob Rousseau. There's the Insurgents podcast, 2 episodes a week, for the Insurgents. That's insurgentspod.com. And I do a live show every day, or Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, for 3-4 hours a day on twitch.tv/Rob Rousseau. That's TRRS. It starts noon Eastern, 1 a.m. Pyongyang time every single day. So if you want to tune into what I got going over there, there's a wide variety of things that we'd like to talk about and discuss. And I do a lot of interviews and cool stuff over there. So that's what I got going on.
I saw you had Ronnie Akalik and Eugene Pereira on not that long ago. Those are both fantastic people.
I've had a lot
on.
of really
So
cool people come and talk to me on there.
Yeah, that's absolutely awesome. So again, thanks Rob so much for coming on and doing this. We'll play the song Work at the end of this. And thanks so much for taking your time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, man. Thanks for having me.
Face down in a parking lot. Night shift was all she's got. Lights go out when she hits the floor. Nobody wants to work no feels heavy and she's tasted blood. Lost her prom pictures in a basement flood. Doesn't know if she can make it out that door, but nobody wants to